I never imagined that my relationship with my brother could go this far. Mark, he's 3 years older than me, always had charisma, but at the same time he was inexplicably domineering. In our childhood years, he knew how to earn recognition from friends and teachers alike, but at home, within the walls of our house, he turned into a real tyrant. My parents and I constantly argued about his special role in our family, but back then, I was still too young to realize. All of this was laying the foundation for future events. It all started on that very evening when Mark first called me to his place, closing the door behind us. In his hands was a packet, thick, with neat handwriting on the cover. I immediately realized it wasn't a bank notification about some promotion. "Listen," he said evenly, almost friendly, "I've got a problem here. Will you help?" I sat down in the chair, trying to figure out what he meant. A problem, he kept saying, but Mark's problems were never small. "How much?" I asked cautiously, bracing for the worst. He named a figure that left me stunned. 5,000 euros, not 1,000, not a couple. 5,000. My first thought was, "You're joking." But in his gaze, I saw icy composure, and it wasn't a joke. "Cover my obligations," he said softly, almost smiling, "or you're done in this family." My heart stopped for a second. The words "done in this family" sounded ominous, but I'd long trained myself to distinguish emotional games from reality. I laughed because what else was left? "Deal," I replied, trying to stay calm. But inside, something broke. The laughter wasn't real. It became a tool, a shield to hide the true fear. I knew this was the start of something much more serious than a simple financial agreement. A few days passed before I dared to look at the figures Mark had mentioned. He led a life full of risks: credit card debts, loans for expensive gadgets, bets on sports matches. It seemed he never thought about the consequences. And now all of it fell on my shoulders. I met up with friends at a cafe, trying to relieve the tension. "Is your brother completely nuts?" asked Thomas, my old friend. "Apparently so," I replied, feeling the weight in my chest grow heavier. "And the most amazing thing, he truly believes I'm obligated to pay it." "Are you really going to do it?" Thomas raised his eyebrows in surprise. I froze. Honestly, I wasn't sure. On one hand, there was family, parents, moral duty. On the other, I was simply being blackmailed, and who knows what it would lead to if I refused. That evening, I sat in my room, going over possible options. Every variant was awful. If I paid, it would just be the beginning. Mark wouldn't stop. If I didn't, I could lose connection with my family, and who knows what he'd do next. I closed my eyes and remembered our early years. When we were kids, Mark often took my things, promising to return them but never doing so. I learned to put up with it, swallow the insults. But now, the stakes had risen to incredible levels. The next morning, I got a text from him. "Have you decided?" I opened the chat, my fingers trembling. The response I typed was simple: "Deal." And this is where the real story begins. Because Mark didn't expect my move. He thought I'd tremble, that I'd be sullen and submissive. But I prepared for surprises. And then I launched my plan, which even I didn't fully understand. In childhood, I often saw how our parents preferred to ignore Mark's antics. Every time he yelled or started fights, Mom would silently leave the room, and Dad would try to find common ground. This gave Mark confidence that he could control anyone. I remember an incident when Mark took my first paycheck from a summer job, claiming it was a lesson in financial literacy. I believed him, and I was ashamed to tell our parents. They always called us close brothers, but in reality, their love was like scales. Lots of leeway for the older one and the expectation that the younger should be yielding. As I grew up, I tried to distance myself. I studied abroad, worked on my career, made friends, and almost forgot about childhood grievances. But Mark, he always found a way to come back. And now, after years, he showed up with a demand that turned everything upside down. I started digging. 5,000 euros, a sum I could earn in a few months of work, but it would be madness to spend it on someone else's debts. I realized that if I agreed, he'd see it as the norm, take without asking, and if I didn't, the consequences could be unpredictable. For several days, I watched him like he was a beast in a cage. He smiled, chatted with our parents, pretended everything was fine. But his eyes betrayed anxiety. He knew I wouldn't be an easy piece in his game. I started developing a tactic. I wasn't planning to pay, but something inside told me, act thoughtfully. Mark was a master of manipulation, and any wrong step could lead to disaster. I started keeping records, every message, every detail, every attempt at influence I documented. It was like psychological weaponry, preparation for a chess match. After I replied, "Deal," Mark seemed to calm down. Outwardly, he returned to his usual life, smiled at parents, joked with friends as if nothing happened. But I felt that this respite was just the beginning of the real battle. He was waiting for the moment to test how ready I was to submit to his will. The first days after our agreement were calm. I tried to focus on work, studies, on not thinking about the debt. But every evening I caught myself wondering, what is he plotting? How will he pressure me further? One evening I got a message. "You know family is the most important thing, right?" I felt a chill. This wasn't a simple brotherly chat. It was a threat cleverly hidden under concern. I didn't reply, just observed. A few more days passed. My parents started noticing I wasn't myself. They asked if everything was okay, why I was so often absent, why I was so tense. I couldn't reveal the truth. Saying Mark is blackmailing me meant dragging the family into a drama I had to resolve myself. And then one evening, Mark invited me to dinner. We sat at the table, parents talked about work and vacation plans, and Mark calmly watched me. His gaze was probing, like a chess player evaluating an opponent. "Have you thought about our conversation?" he suddenly said. I pretended to be calm. "Of course, I think it's solvable." He smiled. It was a smile that meant nothing. It just said, "I know you're scared, but I'll test you." A few days later, I realized Mark was starting to act more subtly. He invited me to help him with work, which turned out to be a meeting with his creditors. I understood it was a trap. If I refused, he'd portray me as ungrateful to the whole family. If I agreed, he'd drag me into his chaotic world. I tried to find support from friends. Thomas listened to me for hours. "You need to hold on," he said, "but be careful, Mark won't back down." I realized this was just the beginning of a psychological standoff. Every call, every message from Mark was a potential blow. One day he showed up at my house unannounced. Mom had gone to the store, Dad was late at work. He just stood at the door, smiling. "Hey bro," he said, "ready to discuss details." I felt adrenaline surge. I understood that any action now could either break our bond or strengthen his power over me. We sat on the couch. He pulled out several folders with figures neatly written out. Each folder was like a small bomb ready to explode in my life. "See these numbers?" Mark said. "Each one is your obligation." I smiled, but inside, anger boiled. How could he think I'd be scared? How could he use family against me? "Fine," I said quietly. "Let's start." And that's when the real game began. I started acting my own way. Every step of his I recorded, every call, every message. I built tactics as if we were playing chess. But chess with Mark was deadly dangerous. One wrong move and the stakes multiplied. A week later, I started acting. I negotiated with his creditors, found out debt details, identified weak spots in his arguments. Mark thought he controlled the situation, but in reality, he was just pushing me to prepare a trap for him. This part of the story was meant to show. Tension is building. The reader starts worrying for the narrator, understanding that an inevitable conflict and possible consequences lie ahead. The day after I started recording all of Mark's calls and messages, he unexpectedly showed up at my office. I was sitting at my desk, immersed in documents, when I heard a quiet knock on the door. "Bro, I've got a new proposal," he said, entering and smiling. His gaze was cold as steel. I noticed his hand involuntarily twitch toward his briefcase. Mark loved showing he was armed with information. In his briefcase were documents, photos, debt lists, everything he could use against me. "Listen," he said, "there are people you can help, small amounts, nothing complicated. But keep in mind this affects your status in the family." I nodded, pretending to be scared. In reality, a strategy was forming inside me. I wasn't planning to just pay. I was planning to play by my own rules. The first days were harder than I expected. Every call, every visit was like psychological pressure. But I started noticing patterns. Mark tried to intimidate me, but he did it the same way, almost by template. "You understand that family is more important than anything," he said, trying to evoke guilt. I stayed silent. I wasn't going to give him what he wanted, emotions. One evening, Mom noticed I looked exhausted and tense. "What's going on with you?" she asked. "You barely eat, don't sleep properly." I couldn't tell the truth. Saying Mark is blackmailing me meant pulling the family into a storm I had to control myself. At that moment, I realized, if I lost, the consequences would be catastrophic. Mark could destroy my reputation in the family, make our parents think I was ungrateful and selfish. I started acting subtly. I met with his creditors under the guise of a casual consultant. I recorded every conversation, gathered evidence, understood Mark's weaknesses. He thought he controlled the situation, but in reality, he was preparing information I could use against him. And then came the day when Mark and I were supposed to meet for the transfer of the first part of the debt. I prepared everything in advance. Papers, figures, evidence that could put him in an awkward position if he tried to threaten. When he entered, I met his gaze. He didn't expect such preparedness. "Everything ready?" he asked, trying to hide the tension. I nodded and handed over the papers. But inside, everything boiled. This wasn't just a deal, it was a game for survival. "Look carefully," I said quietly. "We document every step." He froze, his usual smile vanished, leaving only cold astonishment. At that moment, I realized the game was just beginning and the stakes would only rise. I was no longer just a victim. I had become a player, and in this game, losing meant losing more than money. After the first deal, I tasted control. Mark was surprised that I could prepare and not succumb to pressure. He clearly expected I'd give in after the first threats and blackmail, but now the game had changed. Every message, every call from him, I recorded. I understood that Mark relied on fear, and the harder he pressed, the more mistakes he made. "You know, bro," he said one day, coming into my office, "if you don't pay in full, you can forget about the family forever." I raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Are you sure you want this to go public?" He froze, his usual confidence started crumbling. I showed no fear, didn't give in to his emotions, and that angered him the most. The next day, I arranged a casual meeting with his creditors. I wasn't planning to pay anything directly, but I started building a network of evidence of his debts, threats, and manipulations. Files, recordings, correspondences, all of it was now on my computer. Mark noticed the change. He started being cautious, tried to hide his actions, but it was too late. I controlled the information. "Are you setting me up?" he asked once over the phone, his voice trembling. "No, bro," I said calmly, "just documenting facts." Every move of his, I turned into evidence against him, but I didn't rush to publish anything. This was the moment when I could force him to admit his mistakes or lose everything. Mom and Dad noticed changes in our family dynamic. They saw the tension between us but didn't understand the full depth of the conflict. I decided not to involve them directly. The less they knew, the fewer risky mistakes. One evening, Mark tried to arrange an unexpected meeting to discuss resolving the debt. I agreed but prepared a strategy. I recorded all conversations on a hidden device, invited a lawyer who was to be present under the guise of a casual acquaintance. When Mark entered, I noticed his nervousness. He already understood that control was slipping away. "You want this to be civilized," I said quietly, "or shall we continue in the legal field?" He froze, fear flashed in his eyes, a rare moment when Mark was vulnerable. That evening, I realized the key to victory was patience and strategy. Mark never expected someone from the family could play by their own rules. And now I had a trump card that could change the entire dynamic of our family forever. My entire strategy was now aimed at one moment. Mark had to feel that his game was over. I kept all the evidence to myself, but their weight pressed on him with an invisible hand. "I can resolve everything peacefully," I said one day, sitting at the table in the living room, "but only if you're honest." He froze, his usual self-assurance began to shatter. I saw how every breath betrayed his inner struggle. He understood he'd lost, but pride wouldn't let him surrender completely. That day, I met with the lawyer to discuss filing official complaints on all of Mark's debt schemes. We carefully checked every document, every financial flow. This was a game where the stakes were too high to make a mistake. When Mark realized I was ready to act, he tried old tricks, threats, manipulations, attempts at intimidation. But now I saw right through him. I didn't give in to emotions. Every step of his only strengthened my position. "Do you really think you can stop me?" he asked with desperation in his voice. "No, bro," I replied calmly. "I'm just going to show everyone who you really are." The next day, we met with his creditors. I pretended I'd come to help, but in reality, I provided them with full data on his schemes. Some of them started whispering right in front of him. His authority crumbled before his eyes. In the evening, Mark tried to arrange a final conversation with our parents. He hoped they'd take his side. But Mom and Dad had already noticed his deceit and aggression. Their views on the situation changed, and that was my small but powerful triumph. "We're tired of the constant pressure, Mark," Mom said quietly. "It's time to take responsibility for your actions." His face paled. I saw him realize the scale of his isolation. His attempts at manipulation now hit an impenetrable wall of logic and evidence. In the end, I offered him one option: honest admission of the debts and a public apology to the family. He hesitated, but understood there was no choice left. "Fine," he whispered, "I'll do it." I nodded, understanding that the long path of struggle had ended. Mark was defeated not by threats or force, but by strategy, patience, and attention to details. The family began to recover after the shock. Trust returned gradually. And I realized that sometimes strength lies not in shouting louder or paying more, but in controlling the situation quietly, confidently, and wisely.